Please be seated. The record should show that members of the jury have rejoined us in open court. Ladies and gentlemen, as we proceed with testimony from this witness, I am instructing you to disregard the phraseology used, the specific language used in the initial question put to Mr. Bush, in that it called for an opinion regarding how the defendant's blood came to be located on a piece of evidence. My recollection from the testimony we've heard, and you will certainly rely on your recollection of the evidence, is that none of the experts could definitively say that the material found on certain items of evidence came from blood. They could not exclude the possibility that it arrived at its location, and that they could not exclude the possibility that it was caused by saliva, sweat, skin cells, or semen. So I've asked Mr. Maybanks to rephrase the question for Mr. Bush. You are the judges of the facts. It will be up to you to determine the facts of the case that you find to be credible in rendering a verdict in this case. So I would ask you to rely on your recollection and the notes that you've taken. And Mr. Maybanks, if you would please rephrase and repose a question to your witness.
Yes, Your Honor. Paul, based upon the findings in this case, what is the most scientifically supported theory as to how a DNA profile consistent with that of Jerry Burns to a probability of less than 1 out of 100 billion unrelated individuals would be expected to have the same profile found at F5 location that tested positive upon screening for the presence of blood, how that ended up on Michelle's dress?
I object to the form of the question, Your Honor. There's no foundation established to show that this witness has been informed about all the characteristics, the factors that could lead to that possible conclusion. It's not properly the subject of an opinion, either lay or expert in this case.
Mr. Maybanks, response to the objection.
This witness has testified that he's reviewed the entire DCI lab case file and that he has had access to that, and that his opinion in this case is based upon his review of the file, as I posed in the question, based upon the findings of this case. Therefore, based upon his qualifications that he's testified to here this morning that are undisputed as to his being able to offer an expert opinion on the science behind this, and then again, as in direct response to opinions offered by Dr. Spence, that he certainly has the foundation to be able to answer this question.
Your Honor, if I may,
You may.
I would also urge that the question calls for an opinion that is properly reserved to the jury. It invades the province of the jury, calling for an explanation that is an indirect supposition about the guilt or innocence of the accused. So it's not properly the subject of an opinion.
Any further record, Mr. Maybanks?
No, Your Honor.
Based upon the expert testimony that we heard from Dr. Spence yesterday, it is proper for this expert to give his opinion regarding the presence of DNA material consistent with a profile developed attributable to the defendant. Given the fact that we heard testimony about the possibility of transfer being an explanation for that DNA, the presence of that DNA. So that portion of the objection will be overruled. Given the fact that Mr. Bush has had an opportunity to review the case file and all of the documentation submitted with not only the physical evidence but the reports submitted to the DCI for processing the physical evidence in this case. I find that there is a proper foundation for the expert to give his opinion. And finally, under Iowa Rule of Evidence 5.704, an expert is able to give an opinion even regarding the ultimate issue. I'm not making a finding that any opinion about the presence of genetic material at the location we're discussing at this point is the ultimate question of guilt or innocence. I'm not making that determination, but given the testimony that this jury and this courtroom heard from Dr. Spence regarding possible explanation of that genetic material in that location, it is appropriate for this expert to give his opinion in the state's rebuttal case. So those three, the foundation is overruled. I'm finding that there isn't an invasion of the province of the jury if this witness is able to give his opinion. And lastly, that it is proper for Mr. Bush to give an opinion as an expert in the state's rebuttal case, given the evidence that we heard from Mr. Burns' expert yesterday, Dr. Spence. And again, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I've reminded you a couple of times, and I will instruct you when we get to that portion of the trial, that you are the finders of the facts. You are the judges of the facts. I will give you the law that applies in this case, but you are the judges of the facts to make the determination what facts you find to be credible and on which you will rely to deliver your verdict in this case. So those objections will be overruled. And if you can remember the question, Mr. Bush, you can answer it. Otherwise, we can have it read back, or if...
It's up to Paul.
I believe I can answer.
Okay.
Based on the facts of the information that I had relative to this case, that Michelle Martinko was stabbed to death in a vehicle, that it appeared that there had been a struggle based on defense wounds, that again, the fact that if there is a struggle, that an individual could injure themselves, the assailant could injure themselves, especially in a stabbing case, that again, that screening tests indicated the presence of blood on stain F5, which is on the back of that dress. A DNA profile, a major male DNA profile, was developed on the back of that dress from F5. That profile, again, was consistent with the known DNA profile of Jerry Burns. A likely explanation would be, again, that we had a single source, a major male profile on that stain F5, that a likely explanation would be that it would have come from blood. Again, I want to reiterate that our laboratory did not test for any other biological fluids in this case, so did not test for saliva, did not test for skin cells, which we can't anyhow do, did not test for semen. But again, based on the information that I have, that would be a likely scenario as to how Mr. Burns, or how that profile that matched Mr. Burns was detected on that stain F5.
Paul, so obviously, as suggested by some of the evidence in this case and questioning in this case, as you just referred to, there's been suggestions that the areas that tested positive for blood on F5 could contain actually other bodily fluids. But to be clear, do the results that you reviewed in this case affirmatively show that there was blood at these locations?
Again, we can't say that exactly confirm that there was blood. The screening tests indicated the presence of blood on stain F5. And again, the major profile developed was a male profile.
And was there any evidence that confirmed the presence of any other bodily fluid?
Again, there was no other testing that was performed that would have indicated any other biological fluid.
So at this point in time, there's no evidence that confirms, because of the lack of testing, but there's no evidence that confirms there's any other fluid there.
Correct. There was no other evidence to indicate other biological fluids.
Paul, we also heard a statistic, you could call it, by Dr. Spence yesterday that half of the items at crime labs around the country, or half of the items at certain crime labs, currently have transferred DNA on it. Putting aside for a moment where that came from, my question is, isn't any event that results in DNA being found on an item of evidence a transfer event?
I would say, again, almost every situation where we are testing DNA on items of physical evidence, there is a transfer that has taken place, whether it be victims' DNA transferring to suspects' clothing, or suspects' DNA transferring to victims' bed sheets, or suspects' DNA being left at a crime scene. It's typically is some sort of transfer is taking place. They're leaving their DNA somewhere from their body to some other place.
Paul, changing topics here to the packaging and submission of items of evidence for analysis. Your testimony earlier, I think, was that you've worked on over 200 crime scenes, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Did you participate in the collection and packaging of items of evidence at the crime scenes?
Have I, or excuse me, are you talking specifically or in general terms, or?
Have you specifically done that?
Yes, I have done that many, many times.
And what sort of schools and trainings did you attend that would relate to the collection of items of evidence at crime scenes?
Again, there would have been a Iowa Law Enforcement Academy class that I took on crime scene investigation. I've had coursework through the FBI over the years, some on fingerprints, different types of evidence collection, been to other workshops, and then just training by senior members of the laboratory staff.
Paul, when you actually worked these crime scenes, did you package some items together?
Yes.
Okay. And what kind of items would you package together at crime scenes at times?
So sometimes, and again, what we have to realize, and I've done this since 1982, prior to DNA analysis, and then again, post-DNA analysis, but sometimes you would package all victims' clothing together because they were all worn at a certain point in time. This may be done by the state medical examiner's office because they're removing all the clothing at autopsy. So many times they would put all the victims' clothing together. Suspects' clothing, again, could be all put together because they were all worn by the suspect at one point in time. A lot of times, investigators will put together the bedding of a victim in, say, a sexual assault case. They took the fitted sheet, the flat sheet, the pillowcases, and all would put them together in one package.
At the DCI lab, over the years you've been there, has the lab received items of evidence outside of this case that have been collected and packaged together at crime scenes and provided to you for analysis?
Yes.
And does that also include, for example, victims' clothing or suspect clothing?
Yes. Again, they're not packaged together, but victims' clothing would all be in one package. Suspects' clothing would all be in one package.
For what reasons are these items submitted to the DCI laboratory?
Typically, again, physical evidence such as clothing is submitted to the laboratory to help us solve the case. So typically I would be looking for possibly suspects' DNA on victims' clothing, or vice versa, looking for victims' DNA on suspects' clothing, or on bedding in a sexual assault case, suspects' semen on victims' bed sheets. So again, pieces of evidence that we can test and do DNA analysis to help resolve what happened in the case. There's typically, again, going to be a scenario or facts in the case, and we want to either corroborate or refute a possible story and or put a certain individual at a certain place based on DNA.
So in the event that items are submitted, packaged together of the nature that you just described, is it safe to say the DCI lab does not turn away those items even today?
No, we do not.
And at times do those items also not only come from law enforcement, but from sexual assault nurse examinations?
Yes.
In your experience and based upon your knowledge of the protocol at the DCI lab, would or do analysts ever repackage items submitted to them that were submitted together separately to send them back to law enforcement departments?
Again, the laboratory policy is that we return the items of evidence in the packaging that they were received to us from. So the only time that we would repackage evidence would be if the original package, say, has torn open and we can't get it all back in and get it sealed to a point where there could not be contamination or, again, the garment or evidence would fall out of the package. So if you had a big grocery sack and it rips down the side and things are falling out, we would not want that to go out that way. So we would repackage it. So again, we don't have a possibility of cross-contamination or loss of evidence from that item of evidence.
So what, if any, real concerns exist? Or what, if any, issues may occur by packaging items together as far as the transferred DNA?
So again, with that, what you could have is, say, so you've got underwear, dress, bras, you could have some transfer of materials between those items. But again, as long as they're packaged together and in a proper package seal, you would not have transfer of evidence from outside. So, sack to sack transfer, item to item transfer, or something where, I don't know, it's law enforcement agencies bringing it to the laboratory and it's in the trunk of the vehicle. So as long as the items are packaged properly, you should not have a transfer of physical evidence into that package.
In this case, based upon your review of the file, did the packaging of the items of Michelle Martinko's clothing together prevent the DCI lab from finding a profile consistent with the defendant on Michelle's dress?
No.
And the goal as originally, or the request as originally conveyed to the laboratory to attempt to find the presence of suspect's DNA on Michelle's clothes, in the clothes being packaged together, did you see any evidence of an outside transfer that took place?
Again, as far as the testing that was performed, no other foreign DNA profiles were developed except for profiles that, again, match the DNA, well, I would say the deduced known profile of Michelle Martinko, which was on the dress to begin with, and the only other profile that was developed was a male profile that was consistent with the profile of Jerry Burns.
So you observed no circumstances that showed the introduction of any other foreign DNA into these items?
Again, no other foreign DNA besides these two profiles were detected.
In testimony yesterday, we heard from Dr. Spence that swabbing an area of evidence can sometimes remove bodily fluid from it, but could leave behind DNA. And we saw Defense's Exhibit T1. So if we could get that available here, and I'll see if I can find it in the exhibits. Can I approach the exhibits and Ms. Schrock?
You may.
Well, this is exhibit, excuse me, Defendant's Exhibit T1. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Maybe publish that again, Ron?
You may.
And so on this exhibit here published, there's highlighted the portion that refers to F5. And Dr. Spence yesterday, by virtue of his testimony, characterized the amount of DNA present at F5 as believe he said incredibly small or small, and in that it should be bigger in order to find or confirm that the DNA at that location would come from Mr. Burns' blood. Do you agree with that assessment?
As far as F5 is concerned, our analysts did a quantitation determining the amount of DNA that was present on this stain F5. And based on the results that we have here, there was sufficient DNA for us to perform a DNA analysis. What I would say as far as DNA quantitation versus correlation with blood, there really can't be a correlation because different blood stains can have different amounts of DNA. So in background information, the only portion of blood that has DNA in it is your white blood cells, and that is a very small fraction. I'm thinking around 3% or so of the total volume of blood. And so, again, depending on how the blood, again, now we're just talking hypotheticals, how blood is deposited can sometimes vary in the amount of DNA that would be present. So if you have like an injury where it's starting to clot, you're going to have white blood cells that are going to concentrate there because it's helping in that clot and fighting, infection and things. And so you could have more DNA in a small stain that could be actually kind of, I want to say, not so red because there's not as many red blood cells, but again, that can vary dramatically versus you've got like a major cut and say you've cut your wrist and your hand and it's bleeding profusely. That's likely to have a more uniform volume of those white blood cells. But again, it's just going to vary from situation to situation as to how many white blood cells are present in that stain. Also, again, you could have DNA coming from other materials, but it's just going to vary. So basing DNA quantitation on the amount of blood, I say there's not a great, we can't necessarily correlate that as far as based on how much DNA I have present versus how much blood could be present from a stain.
So is this, based upon your testimony then, is this, this number here and this quantitation of DNA meant to indicate at all the amount of blood that would have been present?
No. This, again, information here on F5 is for our analysts to determine how much DNA they need to move forward to perform our DNA STR analysis.
Did you observe, based upon your review of Linda Sauer's work, that there was a need for her to take a larger cutting at that location?
Again, that was not needed. Again, the amount of DNA that was present in her quantitation results here indicated that she had sufficient DNA to move forward with DNA STR analysis.
Based upon that testimony, Paul, and some testimony we heard yesterday about other items that were tested for blood, analyzed for DNA that showed the presence of blood. Is it unusual that some testing of items of DNA where blood was indicated to be present would not result in detecting DNA?
Again, just because you have our screening tests indicate the presence of blood doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be enough of that sample to allow us to get DNA testing. It just varies, again, dramatically on how much of the blood was left or deposited there, the environmental insults that could have taken place. Has it been exposed to high heat, humidity, sunlight, got rained on, or some if it was outside? A lot of factors would go into place here as far as determining whether or not you can get a DNA profile from a sample that you screened positive for blood.
Paul, over your career, have you processed other cases involving evidence from crime scenes that are over 20 or 30 years old?
I would say I have reviewed some cases that are at least 20 to 30 years old. I don't know that I have specifically tested any samples 20 plus years old.
So have you reviewed findings where analysts have been able to develop DNA profiles from that evidence?
Yes.
In order for findings to be developed, such as what was done in this case, resulting in DNA profiles being developed from the evidence, in this case, after approximately 26 years, what kind of storage conditions would need to exist for that evidence to be preserved?
As far as this case or any case, in order for us to perform DNA analysis on old evidence, say up to 26 years old, as long as it was collected properly, packaged properly, and stored properly, we can get results on DNA that's decades old. Again, we've done cases over 30 years old. DNA testing can be performed on, mummies and stuff from Egypt. The testing is that sensitive. So as long as it's stored, say, out of sunlight, direct sunlight, away from high heat and humidity, so again, stored, say, at room temperature in a room, it should be stable for future DNA analysis.
Dr. Spence said yesterday that a snapshot of events explains or can explain the presence of DNA, but you can't be sure of the circumstances of how it got there. My question to you first is on how many different areas of Exhibit F, Michelle's dress, did the DCI find areas that indicated the presence of blood?
Based on the information I have from these reports, there were 9 areas where screening tests indicated the presence of blood.
And from those 9 areas, how many female profiles were developed?
Of those 9 areas, 8 of those areas developed female DNA profiles.
And did all of those 8 areas, were they consistent with each other and determined based upon the investigation to be that of Michelle Martinko?
Again, they were all consistent with each other. One of those was initially collected as what we would call a deduced known of Michelle Martinko, since we did not have her known DNA to test. But again, all of those matched our initial F stain from the dress that was used as a deduced known sample.
And from these 9 areas, you testify that 8 of those areas were found to contain one female profile believed to be Michelle Martinko. How many male profiles were developed?
Just one male profile was developed.
And based upon, again, those findings, was that profile developed found to be consistent to the random match probability numbers that we talked about to Mr. Burns?
Yes, that stain, again, F5, the random match probability, again, was consistent with Mr. Jerry Burns' known DNA profile.
And did the DCI lab in this case find DNA from any other person or did they find any other profile in the dress besides these 2 people?
As far as the results, we have no other foreign DNA profiles were detected.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Cross-examination for Mr. Bush. Mr. Spees.
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Mr. Bush, you weren't involved in the crime scene investigation of this case, were you?
No, I was not.
And how old were you back in 1979?
Oh, my goodness. I would have been 21 years old.
And you joined the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation Laboratory in 1982, 3 years later, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And from 1982 until today, how many times have you personally been involved in the analysis, the review of any of the evidence in this case?
Excuse me, could you repeat the question, please?
Sure. From the start of your work in 1982 until today, how many times have you been personally involved in the review of any of the evidence analyzed at the DCI lab in this case?
I would say approximately a dozen times where I have had conversations with investigators in this case and with our analysts.
And over the course of the years in which you've become familiar with this case, how many times was the evidence consisting of Michelle Martinko's clothing packaged and repackaged?
I cannot tell you unless I do not have all my evidence notes here to see how many times it was packaged and repackaged.
Do you know how it was handled by the Cedar Rapids Police Department before it even found its way to the Division of Criminal Investigation?
No, I do not.
Do you have any information about how it was labeled by the Cedar Rapids Police Department?
No, I do not.
You didn't do any testing yourself in this case, did you?
No, I did not.
And we've heard testimony from retired DCI criminalist Linda Sauer about the way in which she examined the dress. And you're familiar with that testimony?
I'm familiar with the reports that were generated by Ms. Sauer.
And you're familiar with the efforts that she made at Area F5 on Exhibit 7A to, first of all, screen for the presence of blood at F5, right?
Yes,
And she used 2 presumptive tests.
that's correct.
And she was able, as we know, to extract some DNA from F5.
Yes, that's correct.
Would you agree, Mr. Bush, with the testimony of Linda Sauer, the testimony of Mike Schmidt, that it cannot be said whether the male profile at F5 came from blood or sweat or urine or some other biologic source?
That is correct.
So you don't mean to convey to the men and women of the jury that the male profile at F5 coming from Jerry Burns came from blood?
Again, when I testified earlier, I said that would be a likely explanation, but I cannot positively state that.
It's a possible explanation, isn't it?
Yes.
So in your experience in handling crime scenes and in your experience in analyzing and testing evidence that comes to you from law enforcement agencies across the state of Iowa, it is important, isn't it, Mr. Bush, to know how that evidence was packaged before it arrives to you?
Yes, again, the crime scene personnel, whoever submits evidence to us, hopefully have packaged it and collected it in a proper manner.
In fact, we've heard testimony earlier in this trial from at least 2, maybe 3 different witnesses who said that the bundling together or the bunching together of clothing is not good practice. Would you agree with that?
I would say it depends upon the situation of the case. Sometimes, depending on what type of evidence you're looking for.
Well, here we're talking about some very, very important evidence, aren't we?
Yes,
And you've told us that when items are packaged together, there is a risk of cross-contamination between items bundled together, isn't there?
that's correct, between the items that have come in contact with each other that are in that package.
And you were asked questions about the possibility of contamination from outside the packaging, and you didn't see any evidence of that,
That's correct?
so far as you know.
That's correct.
But you would agree, wouldn't you, that when items are packaged together, there's a risk of biologic material falling off one item of clothing and finding its way onto another item of clothing?
Yes, that's quite possible.
You told us that there was no other male profile found in the, on the clothing, is that right?
That's correct. I did not see any other male profiles developed on the dress.
But you've also testified that the only items, the only areas that were screened for the presence of either a male or a female profile were the 9 blood spots found on the dress?
That's correct.
So let me ask you this question, Mr. Bush. Are you familiar with the autopsy findings?
I did not see the autopsy results.
Did you see how Ms. Martinko's body was clothed when it was examined by the medical examiner?
I did not.
Do you know what she had around her neck?
No, I did not.
Did you know that she was wearing a scarf?
I know that there was a scarf submitted with the evidence.
And how many times was that scarf tested?
At this time, I do not know.
Well, it wasn't tested, was it?
I do not see that in the report or the notes.
So you've got a microphone there in front of you. Is your DNA on that microphone right now?
I would say it's quite possible that my DNA is on this microphone.
Well, you were asked by government counsel whether a conclusion can be drawn about the appearance of DNA at various sites in the crime scene, and it's not uncommon, as you said, for a killer to stab himself or herself in a knifing incident. Do you know whether or not a killer looming over Ms. Martinko would have imparted DNA on the front of her dress?
I would say that's possible.
Well, if the killer was breathing heavily or coughing or yelling, would you expect the killer's DNA to be on the front of her dress?
I would say that's possible.
Would you expect male DNA to be on the scarf around the neck of Ms. Martinko?
Again, depends on the scenario or situation.
But we don't know because that scarf was never tested, was it?
That's correct.
And the front of Ms. Martinko's dress was only tested for the presence of blood.
Yes, I believe so.
It was not screened for any other form of biologic material to your knowledge.
That's correct.
Do you know whether the seat of Ms. Martinko's car was screened for the presence of male DNA?
I don't believe it was screened for the, well, just a minute. Where again are you asking about from the vehicle?
Yeah, the seat.
I do not see that evidence was submitted from the seat. I see items submitted from the headliner and the visors, but do not see anything on the seat.
Mr. Bush, you were asked about the presence of DNA in blood, and you gave the men and women of the jury different scenarios about whether the blood was clotted blood, blood indicating a wound that was healing, and the different configurations of how much red blood cells versus how many white blood cells would be found in a specimen of blood. You recall that?
Yes.
So assuming this scenario, assuming someone had just freshly cut himself or herself, you would expect there would be white blood cells in that blood?
Again, there could be. Again, it could just vary, but yes, I would expect some white blood cells to be present.
So how many white blood cells would you expect to be present in one drop of blood?
Again, I can't tell you that right off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look at my journals or my human physiology book to see what, again, a drop of blood, what is that volume, and then I would have to back calculate, but I can't tell you at this time.
Well, there would be white blood cells in a drop of fresh blood, wouldn't there?
Yes.
And each one of those white blood cells had DNA.
Yes.
And the more white blood cells, the more DNA.
Correct.
Well, we grant you that there was enough DNA at F5 for Ms. Sauer to develop a partial male profile. Was she able to determine a complete male profile from that site?
No.
Finally, Mr. Bush, you were asked about an article to which Dr. Spence referred yesterday. I think you have that article in front of you, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Mr. Maybanks asked you if Dr. Spence had testified yesterday that this report confirms that half of the specimens being examined by crime laboratories in the United States consist of evidence from transfer. Do you remember him asking you about that?
Yes.
In fact, Dr. Spence testified that half of the specimens coming into crime laboratories are from dry transfer. Isn't that accurate?
He stated that, or the article stated that?
That the article referred to half of the items occurring in crime labs come from dry transfer.
again, there's several paragraphs here where it talks about this, but I'm just going to read the last sentence or so here. It says, this discovery of the ability to generate profiles. Okay, sorry. This discovery of the ability to generate profiles from touched objects was initially met with disbelief by many within the forensic community, but once verified became a welcome tool for law enforcement agencies. Within several jurisdictions, samples collected from touched objects now represent more than half of the total number of samples processed for DNA profiling. So this refers to just several jurisdictions or several agencies. So they're drawing or extrapolating a conclusion here based on several jurisdictions.
But the reference was to dry transfer, right?
Yes, I believe so.
Thank you. So you've told the men and women of the jury and us that it's impossible to, or it's difficult to make conclusions if you don't know the factors and you don't know the background into how, in this case, DNA got into the car, how DNA got onto Ms. Martinko's dress, right?
That's correct.
So this happened 40 years ago, and we're dealing with the best facts we can, aren't we?
Yes.
And you know, both from your experience and from the work that other criminalists in your lab have performed, that DNA can be found on door handles,
Yes.
can be found on benches,
Yes.
benches in malls,
Yes.
chairs and counters at restaurants,
Yes.
saliva from coughing and yelling.
Yes.
We deal with the best we can in facts like this, don't we?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Redirect, Mr. Maybanks.
Thank you, Your Honor. Paul, as you just answered from Mr. Spies here, indeed, if we had a set of circumstances that could be confirmed for us in front of us, we could say that if somebody touches or ends up on a bench in a mall and transfers DNA somehow in a known way, we could then confirm that, right?
Yes, again, if you have maybe video that shows a person sat there or somebody coughed at this spot, then again, likely it would help corroborate your conclusion that, we have someone's DNA present because we saw the video of them there and they coughed on, I don't know, this bench or something at a mall.
And because you're sitting here right in front of us right now, Paul, and you're talking into that microphone, these questions about whether your DNA might be on there, everybody here could say, well, yeah, Paul's right there, right? So we know that, right?
Correct.
Okay, so facts, data, history is important in order to confirm how someone's DNA gets on an object or a place, right?
Again, that's what we attempt to use is facts or information to help us elucidate what may or may not have happened in a case.
Otherwise, we're just guessing, right?
Pretty much so.
In the world of potential scenarios, in a given set of circumstances, when we have two areas on a crime scene, like in this case, where both areas indicated a positive test for the presence of blood, as scientists or as individuals, we can conclude that it's a very likely scenario that that individual bled not once but twice in that area.
Again, oops, sorry, apologize.
It's okay.
Sorry. So again, our screening tests indicated the presence of blood on numerous items. So we would believe that someone, based on those screening tests, or someone or more than someone bled on numerous items based on our screening tests. It helps us identify stains that we're going to look at in order to attempt to do DNA analysis to see if we can elucidate additional information.
In DNA being great, but as you said, at the same point in time, when it comes to blood, in some circumstances, you're not always going to find DNA. Is that right?
Correct.
Like in this case, for instance, the steering wheel was tested, and is it your recollection that although indicating the presence of blood, there was no DNA that was able to be developed from that area?
That's correct.
So it's not out of the ordinary that some areas where you can say, yeah, our tests show that's blood, we still can't say, well, we were able to get DNA there.
Correct. Just because something screens for the presence of blood doesn't necessarily guarantee that we can get DNA results from that.
As you were asked about on cross-examination, believe it was if a killer was above the victim, as in, well, as could be the case here, given the circumstances, that you might expect to find blood or, I guess, DNA, the killer's DNA on the front of her dress, right?
That's possible.
And also in those circumstances, if during this struggle there was events where the killer was tugging at a dress or touching a dress after cutting himself, you could expect or you could find DNA in blood on the back of that dress too.
Again, depending upon the circumstances, that's a likely explanation.
And this dress was, it wasn't submitted just once for analysis, was it?
No.
It was submitted in 1997, right?
Yes?
And again in 2002,
Yes.
again in 2003,
Yes, I believe so.
okay, and again in 2005.
Yes.
Now, that's quite a few times for the same area of evidence to be examined, isn't it?
Yes.
Once, and I'll just ask you about your familiarity with practice at the laboratory in cases such as this. After numerous attempts have been made to locate a suspect profile or potential suspect profile on a dress, once a profile is developed, is it regular practice for the lab to continue to test items of evidence for the same profile or another one?
Again, if it's a foreign profile, then typically, if that is significant evidence in the case, then typically the laboratory would stop performing analysis. If we're just testing this item over and over and we're getting the victim's DNA on the victim's clothing, again, requests may be made to look for additional stains or add additional items in the case to help, again, solve the case. So if, again, we would find a significant foreign profile that would help with the investigation, typically we're going to stop at that point. One of the things we have to balance is, again, working these cold cases versus, again, testing about 1,500 to 1,800 cases a year for DNA testing. I can't just, as the supervisor, just allow us to spend all our time and all our resources just on one or maybe 5 cases for the whole year. We've got 15 to 1,800 cases coming in, so we have to try and balance our resources with looking at these cold cases versus looking at new additional cases coming in.
And your laboratory works on a lot of these cold cases, doesn't it?
We have over the years, yes.
Okay. Based upon your review of this file and given the amount of testing that was done on Michelle's dress and various other items through the course of this case and investigation, was the finding of a male profile that was sufficient for comparison at the amount of alleles that you were able to identify, was that a pretty big break in the case?
Again, I would assume that that was a significant break or an investigative lead in the case.
A break that, in your experience, would require some follow-up and investigation before, and maybe get some answers before moving on.
Correct.
I think we've covered pretty extensively that the areas at F5 and in the blood from the shift selector indicated the presence of blood. Did any other testing of the dress, like the areas where it was presumed to be Michelle's blood was found, indicate the presence of any other fluids besides blood?
Again, no other testing for other biological fluids, or, excuse me, no other screening was performed to make that determination.
Based upon your testimony today and your experience, you've indicated to us that facts are important in interpreting the evidence. Right?
Yes, again, we try and use facts in a case to help us elucidate or determine what may or may not have happened, and that would help us point our analysts in the direction of where we want to be looking for DNA evidence.
Did you see in this investigation any facts at all that indicated that your laboratory should be looking for the presence of saliva or semen in this case?
Again, based on the facts that we have in this case, we did not choose to do any of those other biological screenings.
I mean, you didn't have any facts that the killer spit on Michelle or anything like that, right?
Again, we did not have those facts.
She had numerous stab wounds and blood all over, right?
Correct.
So would that be a practice of the laboratory in a factual scenario like that to look for saliva?
Again, it depends on, it's a case situation basis. So based on the information we have, we attempt to focus in on the types of evidence that we believe can help us solve the crime or help the investigators move forward with their investigation based on our DNA testing that we do.
And I think you mentioned, or Mr. Spies mentioned in his questioning, this term cross-contamination, which sounds a little eerie, but in this case is the only real risk of any kind of contamination, if you want to call it that, maybe call it transfer, is the only real risk here is the transfer between the same victim's clothing?
So I would tell you, within our laboratory, we go to great pains to not allow what we would call secondary or alternate transfer between different items of evidence, especially between different cases, because we have like a new piece of butcher paper put out each time. We use bleaching to clean down our countertops and things, but we try and be very careful that we don't cross-contaminate items. So in this case, I think it was the victim's clothing. There was dress, I know there was underwear, there was a scarf, I can't remember what else, but they were all packaged together, so we would look at those holistically as far as foreign material that may be present on those items. We, again, hope, and I believe that happened was that the people that packaged this followed proper procedures in sealing these items, or this single package back up as far as evidence-wise.
Paul, with regard to this article again here that we've been talking about, you said within several jurisdictions they are now submitting items for DNA analysis that may involve touch DNA. Is that kind of what you read from that?
Yes.
Okay. Is it a fair characterization of that statement that these law enforcement departments or these jurisdictions are now trying to solve more crimes by searching for this evidence?
I believe that's the gist of this paragraph here.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Additional cross-examination, Mr. Spies?
Yes. Mr. Bush, it goes without saying, although I'm going to say it, that you can't find what you don't look for.
That's correct.
And you've already told the men and women of the jury that there were no other tests for other biologic sources of DNA other than blood on the victim's dress.
Yes, that's correct.
And the other sources we've already heard about could be saliva, could be hair, could be mucus, could be sweat.
Yes, those are possibilities.
Yeah. And again, because you didn't look for them, you don't know that they're there.
That is correct.
And particularly, as you've already told us, you didn't look on the scarf, you didn't look on the front of the dress for any other biologic material other than blood.
What I can say is only the blood was detected on this dress as far as a biological fluid.
Because nothing else was looked for.
Correct.
And while I know that the Division of Criminal Investigation Laboratory takes great steps to avoid cross-contamination when your analysts are examining the evidence, you don't know what happened the 26 years before 2005 when F5 was found and isolated,
No, I do not.
or how many times other people handled that evidence.
No, I do not.
except when it was at the DCI laboratory.
That's correct. That's where we would have had control over those items, or that item.
Okay. Thank you. I have no other questions.
Redirect Mr. Maybanks.
So Paul, your testimony is that only blood was detected on this dress.
As far as our screening tests are concerned, the screening tests indicated the presence of blood on this dress.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Anything further, Mr. Spees?
Nothing else.
Thank you, Mr. Bush. You're excused. I can stay right there.
Oh, yeah,
Thank you,
yeah,
sir.
like that. Thanks, Paul.
Any additional rebuttal evidence from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Spees,
If I could have a moment, Your Honor, just for a brief recess.
you may. We will stand in recess for 15 minutes. As always, members of the jury, please bear in mind that admonition.